So we have our outline. We're going to get straight into the thick of this tutorial. What we're going to start with is, we can't really start with the eyes, as this cow really doesn't have any sort of visible eye. So we're just going to get straight into doing the hair or the fur. It's a bit more like hair rather than fur. So we're going to get straight into that. And what I'm actually going to use to just take away some of the graphite is a kneaded eraser. This one is by Faber-Castell. It's just a really soft piece of like blue tack almost. It's just really kneadable, and all we're going to do is just tack this down onto the surface, and it's just going to lift the graphite. You just want to fold your kneaded eraser every now and then, so you just hide the graphite and so you don't get any sort of graphite smudges. So we're just going to get rid of a small portion of the fur here, right by this horn. So it just lightly lifts the graphite. It's not too much that we can't see the graphite anymore, but when we go over this, we will get rid of the, or we'll lose that graphite in there, but it won't be like really shining through. So you just want to lift it slightly. Like so. So we've just got a small portion here that we are getting rid of. And we're just going to go straight in there with our base tone, which is going to be some of the ivory. And we want to take a nice sharp pencil for this. So I'm just going to give my pencil a nice sharp point to work with. And all we're going to do is just work in the direction that the fur is going. So I'm just really paying attention to the reference photo, and I'm just starting to lay down this colour in the direction that the fur is going in, just using a really light hand to begin with. And we're just following the direction that the graphite was going in. So that's giving us the direction for this clump of fur. So don't worry too much about any sort of bits of fur that are going in a slightly different direction. You just want to map in the general direction of the fur. That's what's important here. So just sort of adding that top layer, this really light section which is sitting on top first. So there's like one large clump here, and then there's a smaller clump that comes down here a little bit. Like so. So we've got a base layer in, so now what we need to do is actually go in and map in some of the darker areas first. Now to do this I'm going to use some of the burnt ochre, and I'm also going to pair that with some of the walnut brown, and that's just going to give us a nice sort of dark tone, and we're even going to go in there with some burnt sienna. So I'm just going to give those pencils a quick sharpen. So we're just going to use the burnt ochre to begin with, and all we're going to do is just look at the reference photo, and we're just going to see where the darkest parts are. And this is mainly where we've added the graphite down. So we've got some of these shapes on the graphite, that's where the darkest parts are, so that's where we're going to be adding some of these tones. So I'm just going to follow the graphite and just going to really gently add this in. So you want to be really light with your pressure to begin with, just to make sure you're getting everything in the right place. And you want to identify and look at this in terms of clumps. So we're going to work on this smaller clump here. So where it comes from the rest of this mass here, you've got some darker areas, just need to add in a little bit more of a base layer here. But you've got some darker areas where it's sitting next to this other small clump here, and that's where you've got a lot of this darker tone. So we're just going to follow the hair direction and just fill in the shapes that that little section is making. So just lightly at first, and just plotting in all of the shapes around there as well. And then just coming further up and just filling in some more. So we're just using this to define all of the clumps first, and then we'll go through and we'll blend everything out. So don't worry about blending any of the harsh edges or anything like that at the moment. You just want to get in those dark shadows so you can fill in the form of the hair. So we move on to our next section and just start to do exactly the same. Filling in small shapes and working in small sections, just looking at the reference and identifying where you've got some small sections and just working on small section at a time. If you work on too large a section, I find personally that it becomes a little bit more of a task and I get confused easily, so it's just easy to work on small sections like this. And it's also good to reference your black and white photo as well, because it's easier to identify the tonal values. So if you're finding it difficult to identify where the dark parts actually are, then turn to your black and white reference, have a look at that, and then make sure that you're adding everything in correctly. So we've identified a few different clumps and strands, so I'm just going to go in and darken up a few of those with some of the burnt sienna. So just going a step darker on a couple of these areas once more. So we want to work on darkening these, because when we start to add the mid-tones, these will be lost a little bit. So you just really want to develop your darker areas a little bit more before you go through and add your mid-tones. So this is where I'm also just starting to add a few of these darker strokes through the length of the hair, just to break it up a little bit, while still maintaining these really dark areas. And then I'm just going to take the walnut brown and just darken the really dark areas once more. Like so. So then we've got a small clump of fur or hair mapped out there. So we're just going to come down the fur section and map in a little bit more. So we're still working on this super bright clump here, but we're also just going to work in some of the dark under tones. So where you can see this overlap of this clump of fur, you've got some really dark sections in between, and we need to go in and we need to add in those darker sections. So I'm going straight in with some of the burnt sienna, and I'm just going and outlining the very bottoms of these bits of fur that I've added here, just where you've got the real dark areas. You can see on the black and white reference photo just where these need to be added. So I'm just going in and just gently shading this down just to define the edges of these clumps of fur, and just bringing in a few dark sepia lines coming up through the fur as well, just to break it up a bit more. So you're just looking at where the shadows are and you're recreating those shadows to begin with. So just started to add the shadow in here, just on this underside of this clump right here. And I'm also identifying the direction of the fur that's underneath this bit, and it's sort of coming out and coming up from this middle section here just above the nose, and it's sort of coming up and down. So as I am coming further down, bits of hair, I'm just looking at that direction and just mimicking that with my pencil so that it's just not all going up, so you've got this fur direction underneath as well. So when we do come to add this bit underneath, we've already got this fur direction sort of going in the right direction. So I'm just going to go into some of these areas with a little bit of the walnut brown. So a little bit here and there, just real light layers here. We're not going for like a hard pressure or anything like that. So you can see now we've got this really nice area formed up here. So we just need to come further down this little lock of hair here, and I'm just going to switch to using the burnt ochre, and I'm just going to continue to bring a few strokes down through this section and just sort of add in a little bit of definition, a little bit of flow to this bit of fur. Also just coming off the side of this clump here where you've got this darker patch on the ear, just adding this in directly next to it as well. Okay, so now that we have that in, we can continue to just add in this wheaten tone, and then we can blend everything out. I mean, it's looking pretty good as it is, and you should be able to see some sort of definition between the clumps, and you should be able to see the form of the hair and how it falls. So what I'm going to do for this is just put a really, really light base over the cream of some of the light flesh. So just really lightly with this pencil. Just almost like glazing the colour over the top. Then I'm going to take some of the burnt ochre and do exactly the same. Really light, and then we're going to take some yellow and glaze that over the top, and then we're going to blend with the white. So I'm going to take the white pencil. We could also blend with the cream, but I'm just going to go in with the white pencil. I'm just going to give mine a sharpen, so I've got a nice sharp point to work with. So I'm just going to go over the entire thing, just blending really lightly, not pushing hard or anything. I want to try and preserve the tooth of the paper because I still have a few details and everything to add over here. But just going over the entire thing, even these darker areas, just blending it all together. Just remembering also to work in the direction that the fur is going in. And you can see we've got this really nice sort of wheaten tone developed. We just need to go in here and just start to blend out some of these dark areas and just strengthen the tone of some of the dark areas as well. But we've got a really lovely tone and colour built there. Really nice base for everything to work upon. So I'm going to take some of the Indian red. I'm also going to use some red violet for this as well. And we're just going to develop some of those shadows, these dark places where the fur is overlapping. I'm going to develop those. And we're also going to take some of the cinnamon and some more of the burnt ochre and everything through the wheaten tone of that patch of hair. Just giving the Indian red a little bit of a sharpen. So I'm just going to take some burnt sienna to begin with into this and just develop some of these darker bits. Just really hype up the contrast and just sort of blend them up and into the fur. Gently shading. I'm going to just switch to the Indian red as well and add some of that down in there just to bring the shadow a little bit of life. And I'm also just going to really gently add this tone to this undertone or this colour underneath this fur. Just switching back and forth between that and the burnt sienna. And just bringing some lines into the little, I suppose you'd call it his or her fringe. Just bringing it into that area. So whilst we're doing this process, I'm also just going to start to map in some of the darker areas around either side of some of these clumps and around some of the other areas as well. So as we work into this middle section, you've got these sort of almost kind of like a Venetian red, like a muted Venetian red tone, these areas here, and there's some dark areas in between this really light tone and those little clumps. So I'm just going in with the burnt sienna and just adding those darker areas in so we can further define this little patch of fur. Just using a combination of the burnt sienna and the walnut brown for this. Now the key here is to really take your time and build up these areas. When you sort of rush this kind of thing, it does show, so you really need to take your time and just pay attention to the shapes, pay attention to the shadows first, so fill in your base tone, then pay attention to your shadows, and then you can pay attention to your mid-tones and start to flesh and bulk everything out. So that's what we're doing here. So I'm just using some of the the Indian red to just go into some of the fur up here, just to tone it slightly, just using a really light hand, just really soft little fur lines. I'm going to blend them out with a little bit of the white, smooth it out a little bit. And I'm also just going to use some of the burnt ochre to just blend everything together. So just adding this tone to the edges of these patches of fur and just adding in lines to create the texture of the fur. And then just darkening up areas, going right in between some of these lines up here, just really coming up into the fur, just to really break it up, make it really choppy. So just paying attention to the individual clumps, and when I say clumps, what I mean is the areas in between two shadow points. So this section here that I'm working on would be a little clump. This whole little hanging down fringe section would be a clump there. So I'm just working on like those areas. That's what I mean when I say in terms of clumps. So I'm just blending out with the white once more. We're going to do a lot of blending with the white to get this tone. I'm going to use some of the raw umber just to add a little bit more of like a greeny brown tone to some of these areas. And just really lightly going over with the walnut brown just to create a little tiny hint of a shadow. Oh, I don't want too much of a shadow through this section, it's really light. So I'm just really gently using the walnut brown and just gently lining, gently blending everything out. So I'm going to use some of the Indian red just to come off of some of these shadow patches and just create lines coming in just to create a little bit more of like a messy hairstyle. I'm also going to use some of the manganese violet just to tone some of the orange here, just to help bring out those really vibrant orange tones. So before we go in and work too much on this now, we're just going to move on to our next area. I find that if you work too much on a particular area, it can start to look a little bit too contrived and too styled. So I just like to move on to different sections every now and then come back and assess it as a whole, because generally when you add another patch of curly fur or this type of hair, you tend it tends to, when you add the next bit, it tends to make this look completely different anyway. So that's what we need to do now. I'm just going in and just adding a little bit of toning with some of the olive green yellowish first. And of course we can always go in and lighten and lift some colour if necessary. So we're going to move on and just do this ear section here. There's a few really dark strands coming down from this sort of fringe section as well, and then we'll go in and move to do the side of the face before going in to do the horn, which is a completely different texture. So for the ear, we're just going to employ exactly the same process. Instead of putting down a base layer of ivory first, I'm just going to go straight in with some of the burnt sienna. We've got some really dark shadows here, so I'm just going to go straight in with the burnt sienna. And we're just going to gently map in some of the really dark areas, again paying attention in terms of clumps and in shadows. So just blocking in some of the darker areas. I do have a little bit of a lighter bit here, so I'm just going to take my putty eraser and just lift the graphite off of this bit. I'm just going to use the ivory just to add in this one little lock that sort of comes down the side of the face here. It's quite light in tone. Like so. I'm just going to gently tone that with some of the burnt ochre. And just gently blend it up into this sort of little fringe area before going back to the burnt sienna and just adding in some of the dark areas around it. So off the side of the face here there are some individual strands, so I'm just using the point of the dark sepia pencil just to add those in. I'm going to use some walnut brown on the side here as well just to really darken it up. And then as this comes onto the face, the direction sort of changes, so you've been going in like a downwards motion just to fill in this lock here, and then as you come into the face it sort of curves in. So just trying to mimic that. So we're just going to add in some of these curly tendrils of the fur. So I'm just switching out to the burnt ochre and just adding in that. So just kind of adding in that kind of feel to that section, just coming in with some of the strong colours and just laying down some really crisp lines, just crossing over one another. So we've got that nice overlay of colour, got that really nice crisscross of those little tendrily areas as well. I'm going to use a little bit of the light flesh and add some of those tones in this bit as well. Just continuing back up this lock of fur with the burnt sienna. So it's a really delicate process, a really slow one. Then we're just going to come along the ear, and again just looking at the reference photo and identifying where the darker areas are, and then plotting the dark areas out in terms of clumps. So at the moment I'm just sort of drawing around some of these clumps. Just marking in really gently these little shadow areas first. Really gently so that we can lift any colour if necessary, if we realise that we've added the shadow in the wrong place. Although for this type of fur it doesn't really matter if you don't follow 100%, you just want to get the general sort of feel and the texture of the fur down. That's what we're really going for here. So once we've got these areas mapped in, then we can go in and just apply a little bit more pressure and a few more layers and just really darken that up. So I'm just creating little lines. Just creating the shadows within the fur. And then just leaving the gaps for the lighter sections. And going into those dark sections with some of the walnut brown, just where we've got some really, really dark areas. So now that those darker areas are mapped in, you can see the form of the fur, you can see the direction, you can kind of get a sense for where the highlights are going to fall. Now we're going to go in with our base layer, which is going to be the ivory. We're just going to fill this in all over. So going into those darker areas, because that's also going to help to blend those out a little bit. And we're going to come off the bottoms here and just create some really sort of swishy, really loose tendrils of the hair. I'm also just going to switch to using the Indian red and just add in some darker tones just down here. I'm going to go in and just go over with some of the burnt ochre. This is just going to give us a nice secondary base layer. So again, coming off the ends and just creating these sort of really wispy, really fine little bits of fur. There's a little bit of a yellow tag within the ear, but I'm not actually adding that in on mine, I'm just going around it, filling that in with fur. So filled in that ear with the base tone of the burnt ochre. So I'm just going to highlight a few areas where there's some really rich colour with some of the cadmium orange, which is just on the edge of the ear here. And I'm just going to go back in with some more of the burnt ochre and we're just going to darken up the tone. So we're just going to go with one more pass of a layer of this colour. Just going to avoid going into that lighter toned area though, apart from a few sort of contrasting tones, so some darker tones. We're just going in once more with this layer, just shading it all over pretty much, because it's pretty dark on this side, on this bit of the ear, so I'm not too worried about it being too light, or leaving it too light. So now we need to make up the tone of this fur. So I'm going to use some of the Venetian red, I'm also going to use some of the Indian red, and we're going to use some more of that burnt sienna as well. So with the Venetian red, I'm just going to lightly shade this over. There's a little part of the fur that comes up over the horn here which I haven't quite added in. I'm just going to go in there with some of the ivory and just add that in. So I'm just going over the entire thing with the Venetian red. And then I'm going to go in there with some of the Indian red, and this time I'm just going to work sort of into the darker areas and just gradually blend them out. And then I'm going to just take some of the walnut brown, I'm just going to develop some of those shadows and just add in some individual sort of fur lines. Let's break it up a little bit. Also just blend it out just by gently layering some of the walnut brown around the outside of those areas as well. I'm going to take some of the Caput Mortuum Violet here as well, just work into the bottom sections of the fur on the ear just to darken it. Now what I'm going to do is also just take some of the white. I'm just going to gently lay some of this over just to bring in a few highlighted areas and just create this sort of faded red tone, which is a lovely shade. Just going to add some of the Venetian red to the top section here as well. So I'm also just going to sharpen this white so I've got a nice fine point so I can go over and make some finer white lines over the top. So just adding in a few little highlight areas, basically. Oops. So I'm just going back in between some of these little white areas with some of the Caput Mortuum Violet just to really hype up those white areas a little bit more. Now what we're going to do is just take a scalpel or a craft knife, whatever you want to call it, and what we're going to do is just lift a little bit of colour where you've got this lighter section coming over this darker section. Now I've got a blade by Slice here, which is the same kind of thing as the blade by, what do you call it, the other one that I usually use. Can't think off the top of my head right now. You guys know what I mean anyway. But we're just going to use this to just gently scrape away some of the colour where the lighter patch comes over into this darker patch, so we get some really fine lines. So as with any scalpel, you want to make sure that you practice first. So you want to be able to just gently remove the colour. You don't want to actually be like slicing into the paper because that's obviously going to damage it. So you want to work away from the direction of the blade, and you just want to gently scrape away some of the pigment. Now this works best when you have a lot of pigment down onto the paper and you've got like quite a nice waxy build up. So this is perfect for coming into this lighter patch here and just working over this darker patch, because on the darker patch we've actually added quite a lot of pigment down, so it's absolutely perfect. But this method works great in creating these like wispy overlay lines. We can also go into some of the areas on the ears and just remove a little bit of colour. This works absolute wonders. It does create some really fine lines. So I haven't actually mentioned this product within any of my tutorials before, but I have been practicing with this. It's exactly the same as using an ordinary craft blade, it just, this one stays sharper for longer, you don't have to change the blades as often, which is always ideal. Anything that sort of lessens the workload for us artists is a big deal. So I'm also just going into this little clump of fur and just lifting a little bit of the colour just to lighten it. And I'm also just going to work this into these darker areas here where it overlays and just scratch out some fine lines over the top. Now I will go into detail on the techniques portion of the tutorial, exactly how to do this. There have been other tutorials that I have produced before demonstrating this technique as well, so if you want to practice with it and just make sure that you're using this correctly, then I really do advise you go and check those out before going in and adding any of these kinds of details over the top. So I'm just going in and just using the walnut brown and just gently shading some areas. I'm also just going in and slightly darkening up these locks underneath these light locks here, just so that when we do go in and just scratch away a little bit more, we have this really nice overlay. We can really get rid of the colour here. So I'm just darkening these areas up. So with a little bit more pigment down there, just going in and just glazing over some of the burnt sienna, just to add a slightly different tone, just to really kind of warm it up a little bit. Once that is a lot darker around the edges, then this will really show up. So I'm just going to go into this area here and just do exactly the same. Just gently scraping away and lifting the colour. It's ever so subtle at first. And just keep wiping the end of the blade as well. It's probably best to do that with gloves or some kind of protection over your fingers, and not like I'm doing with bare fingers, because this is a ceramic blade. It is an awfully lot sharper than an ordinary blade as well, so it can cut you a lot easier. So just be careful when you are wiping the end of your blade, that you're just protecting your fingers as much as possible. So you just want to gently work this over, just really gently and slowly remove the colour where necessary. Of course, if you don't want to use a scalpel, you can go in and remove the colour or overlay some gouache or some acrylic ink or some titanium brush and pencil titanium white mixture. Anything like that is going to be work wonders at getting red or going over and adding in these really sort of soft lines over the top. But that I'm pretty happy with, so I'm just going to place the top back on to my slice tool and just store it away and move on to the next part of this. We're going to fill in the horn here, and we're going to fill this in so we don't have to come back over and muck up any of the colours, muddy anything or smudge anything. So we're going to add in the horn next. Now this is a really smooth texture, so all we're basically going to do is just put down a layer of warm grey one along the length of the horn, and then just tone it appropriately just by going in and shading and burnishing and blending with that white pencil. So before we do that, we need to just lift the graphite pencil. So I'm just going in and using the kneaded eraser. Another tip that you could lift the colour out to get the fine lines with your kneaded eraser. So if you go in and use this and tack it down, it does actually pick up quite a bit of the coloured pencil. So you could make your kneaded eraser into a really fine point and pick up some colour that way. It does pick up quite a lot of colour, but you do have to be patient with that method. You do have to tack it down a fair amount in order for it to pick up an adequate amount to really lighten it. So whichever method you're going to use to add in any sort of light areas, just make sure that you're patient with it, and make sure that you are patient with this texture. It does take a lot of working for it to look realistic, and it does take a lot of sort of stepping back and analysing your work to make sure that you are 100% happy with it. And I always recommend that you work in lighter layers as well, so that you can erase any mistakes that you make a lot easier. So I'm just adjusting the lock here just by going in with a little layer of the raw umber, just darken that patch up there, and just add a little bit of toning to this patch of fur here as well. So with the horn, we're going to take the warm grey one, and we're just going to work from the tip backwards. Just putting a base layer down of the warm grey one over the entire thing, working back into the hair as well. There's a darker graphite here, so I'm just going to use the Jackson's eraser just to fully get rid of that. Now what we're going to do here is we're just going to start off and add in some obvious tones that we can see. So straight away I can see some pink, I can see some purple, and obviously we've got the dark area up here. There's also a slight blue tinge where you've got the sun or the light hitting the horn at the top here. And that's what the ultramarine is for. So we're just going to start with that ultramarine, and we're just going to really gently add this down to the top. You just want to really lightly glaze this down. You don't want to go in with hard pressure because this is just a really subtle colour, and you're just going to add this to the top part, mainly in the middle here, and just gently feathering it out to either side of the horn. Then we're just going to take some of the light flesh, and we're just going to basically shade that down the entire sort of first half directly next to on top of the ear here. Just going to shade that down. So you want to keep working in the same direction. Then in the middle we've got a tiny little bit of purple, so we're going to add some really light layers of the manganese violet. And under that we've got some orange tones where you've got the colour of the fur reflected, so we're just going to add in some burnt ochre directly underneath that purple. And then along the top here we've got some darker tones, so we're just going to gently layer down some raw umber for the first little section. And then we're just going to lightly layer down some of the walnut brown. So towards the tip there is a slightly more orange tone, so we're just going to go back in there with some of the burnt ochre. So I'm being careful not to go too close to the very edge because we've got that blue tone shining through, so we want to preserve that as much as possible. I'm also just going to go into the very underside and just add this dark brown tone for the shadow. Just adding in some shadows with the dark brown where necessary. And then what we're going to do is we're going to blend that out with the white pencil, and then we're just going to layer up a couple more times using the exact same tones and developing where necessary. So using the white pencil really lightly. You can use a solvent blender as well if you find it easier, but if you're using a solvent blender you might have to layer up a little bit more, otherwise you're going to get a grainy, inconsistent look. So whatever method you're using, just make sure you're using the appropriate amount of layers. With the white pencil, this amount of layers is actually fairly decent. There's not that many layers down, but it does just blend it out nicely, and then we can continue to build. And because we've blended with the white, we've got a nice smooth, sort of waxy kind of surface to work upon. So we're going to start at the top this time and just work our way down and just develop these tones. So we're just using the same sort of pressure, just a light pressure to add these colours in. So just layering the same colours. So with another layer down, then we're just going to add in or blend with our white, smooth it out once more, it just really desaturates the colours as well, blends them together really nicely. So we're beginning to get a really nice smooth texture of the horn, and we've got a really nice range of tones building within there. So I think the tonality is almost where we need it. We just need to go in and just adjust the shadows and start adding in some texture now. So I'm also just going to start to build in a little bit of the warm grey 4, and we're also going to build in some of the dark indigo. Just going to give the dark indigo a quick sharpen. So we're just going to use the warm grey 4 just to start developing the shadow down the bottom here. I'm going to layer that in with some of the raw umber. And also just really lightly using the walnut brown. So we've got a nice shadow built where the horn is sort of touching the ear there. I'm also going to layer some purple in there just to accent that orange, just helps to develop that shadow as well. Now there's a few small strokes of blue, so I'm just starting to add in some textural lines now, so just making small marks with the pencil to just build in a type of texture, and just using the tones as I'm seeing that on the reference photo. So that's mainly the purple and the blue, and then just desaturating them a little bit with the grey. There's also a little bit of a stronger pink, so I'm going to switch to using a little bit of the cinnamon. And this is also just going to be used to blend some of the shadows together. So some of the texture I'm building in with the warm grey 4. Just gently lining this over the top, just following any sort of graininess, any grain that I can see on the reference photo. So the texture of this is mainly just made up of small lines like fur, but these are more parallel to one another. And it's not grouped all over. I'm going to take some of the dark sepia and just make some darker lines. I'm just going to sharpen this pencil as well. So just really darkening into that shadow. And then just adding in a few really light pressured lines through the texture of the horn there. And then just working further back and just starting to layer down some more of those tonal colours. using the light flesh, the cinnamon, the manganese violet here. I'm going to work in a really tiny amount of the dark indigo. I'm just making really tiny lines, following what I was doing with the texture through the back or through the bottom of the horn here, just to create a really nice texture. I'm going to add in a little bit of burnt ochre and then just start to darken up this orange section underneath the horn just here, using that burnt ochre, and then I'm going to use some of the burnt sienna I'm also going to use some of the dark red to just start to enhance that darker area. I'm going in with some Caput Mortem Violet just to do the shadow on the underside of the horn there. Just really getting into where the horn meets the ear hair and just really darkening that using the walnut brown. Just adding in a little bit of texture by bringing some lines out. I'm just going to develop these purple tones up here. I'm going to tone them with some grey as well, so that warm grey 4. Also just starting to desaturate all the way along the horn. So we've got a nice dark area. I'm going to use the walnut brown, and I'm just going to start to build a slight texture on this part just by making small dots and a few like little sort of zigzag motions just to sort of build that almost like a keratin texture. So when you've got like a little bit of a crack in a nail or something, that kind of texture. I'm going to take the dark sepia and really start to darken this top section of the horn now as well. I'm going to use some of the walnut brown just to gently glaze some brown tone over here. And at the top of the horn we need to just go a little bit sort of more red in tone, so I'm just going to use some of the Indian red at the top here. We're going to desaturate it with the dark sepia anyway, so just make sure that's really nice and red, going around it with some of the burnt ochre. And then adding in some burnt sienna. some dark sepia, and I'm just going to tone this with some of the manganese violet and also with the dark indigo. So I'm going to use the white pencil just to highlight the very top of the horn here as well. It's pushing quite hard just to give that a little bit of a reflection. Just using a little bit of the raw umber to add a little bit of a yellow tone. Now what we need to do is just bring some of the fur up here and just drag it over. So I'm just using a hard pressure from the white pencil just to fill in that section of that white fur, or that wheaten toned fur, and I'm just using the raw umber just to add a little bit of a yellow tint to it, and then going back in with the white and blending it out before going in with some of the burnt ochre and just adding in a few darker strands. I'm going to use some of the Indian red to just help develop a few of those darker strands as well. I'm going to blend this out with the ivory, not using the white because I don't want it too desaturated. I'm just using a fairly hard pressure just to blend everything together through here as well. I'm also just going to use some of the cinnamon just to add a little bit of toning here and there to this lock. And then finally just going in with the dark sepia and just going around where I've just added in that white section to add a little bit of shadow. Also using the walnut brown to do the same. I'm just looking at the black and white photo when doing this to just see where those darker shadows need to be accented a little bit more. I think we are pretty much there with the horn. If anything, it just needs a little bit more blending with the white just to sort of blend all of the colours together, just dilute it and sort of knock it back a little bit. But other than that, it's pretty much there. So now that we've done that, we can just move on to the rest of the curly fur. What we're going to do is we're going to do this whole lock of this really complicated, complex texture where you've got a lot of these shadows, and just get that block done because that is the hardest part of this tutorial, and then the rest of it is just really nice, sort of soft, fluffy, textured fur. It's going to be a whole lot more easier to do than this bit. So if we get the core, most difficult part done now, then we can just focus on getting the rest of it looking right. And the use of the slice tool or the scalpel is just going to really help us in getting this overlay of the white, of the lighter tones of fur. So let's move on and do this. So this part here, all we're going to do is exactly the same thing. We're going to use the putty eraser to just lift the graphite a little bit, and then we're just going to go in and map in all of our darker areas. So I'm just going to use this to just tack down and just lift some of that graphite. Just sort of smushing it together as we go round. I'm just going to work on small sections again once more. So I'm just going to work on this small lighter section here, just work on the very light fur first and then go in and work on the bits underneath and then the very dark bits underneath that. Just makes it a lot more manageable to work in that way. So just really lightening this up as well. So what we're going to do is just put down a quick base layer using the ivory, just so we have these lighter sections. Just sort of working in the general direction that I can see a majority of this fur going in. Just working across these bits for the time being. I'm just going to use the Jackson's eraser just to go into the edge and just get rid of that graphite so we don't have that sort of harsh line showing through. And as we come across the top along the edge here, I'm just going to bring in the fur lines and just bring them off the side so we get that nice sort of feathered effect almost. And then we've just got the same kind of like long fur coming off to the side by this horn over here. I'm just going to add that in for now. So now what I'm going to do is just take my burnt sienna, I'm going to give it a little bit of a sharpen so I've got a nice sharp point on there, and we're just going to work into the shadows. So I'm also just going to use burnt ochre for this as well, so I'm going to sharpen that pencil up as well. Just going to go in with the burnt ochre first, and I'm just going to look at both the colour reference and the black and white reference and just see straight off where the sort of darker areas are. So we've got a dark area underneath this little lock of hair here. So I'm just going to map in that, just going around the very edge of that particular piece of fur or hair. And just fill in the rest surrounding this little bit that's coming over. So mainly just sort of adding these darker tones around the edges of each individual fur section. So where you've got some overlap, just adding this in. So just as we come along, just filling in all of the sort of darker sections, just using the burnt ochre. So just really taking time to just identify where all of the different strands are and the different directions, because there's lots of different things going on here. So you just want to take your time and just plan out the darkest areas. Even if it's just like a dark line, you just want to add that in. Just mapping out the shapes. So just really gradually filling in all of these details. It is really important to just take your time with this. If you find yourself losing focus, then just take a little break, come back to it, and work over with fresh eyes when you're a little bit more sort of alert of the different fur directions and that kind of thing. So you can see it's kind of mapped out now. Everything's kind of looking like it's got some kind of direction, and I'm just focusing on different locks of the hair. Lots of different directions. So, got the burnt ochre lines down, so now we're going to go in and darken some of those with the burnt sienna. So this is where we just need to reference the black and white image a little bit more and just add in the real darker areas with this pencil. So just adding in the darker sections and just lightly using the burnt sienna around the very outer edges of the real dark areas just to blend it out a little bit more. So just filling in really tiny details, really tiny areas. Just going around a few of these strands here now. Really darkening some of these sections up. So we've got in some of the really dark areas within the clumps of fur there. So I'm just going to go in with some of the light flesh. Just put a really light layer of this down. I'm going to follow that with some of the yellow ochre as well. So whilst I'm adding this down, I'm making sure that I work in the clumps and work in the direction that the fur is going in. And obviously leave out like really bright areas of the hair. So this strand just here, there's another strand here that's really light. But just making sure that I overlay the other strands going in the right direction. So it's just going to help us achieve that kind of wheaty tone, and layering the yellow is just going to help exaggerate that. Just going to come off the edge with some of this light flesh tone. So just really lightly filled that in. Going to go in with the yellow, and then I'm going to blend that out with the white. So again, really light layer of this. Going to blend that with the white so we get a nice sort of blend, as well as sort of just desaturate the colours a little bit as well. So again, just using a light pressure, and I'm working in the direction that these strands are going in. going over all of the dark areas as well. It's just going to help to just blend everything together really, really nicely. So what we're going to do now is just take some raw umber, we're going to take some Venetian red, we're going to give these a nice sharpen up. We're also going to use some of the burnt ochre, and we're just going to lay down some fur lines and just start to build some of the tones around some of these darker areas, and also just darken up some of those dark areas with some walnut brown. So I'm just going to give these pencils a quick sharpen. I just need repointing. I'm just going to take the walnut brown first and just work into the darker area or areas first. That's mainly just this bit here. Just working some of that into the darker areas, and you can sort of see the definition between certain areas now, which is really, really good. So I'm just going to start off with the burnt ochre, and I'm just going to concentrate section by section now on just darkening, just using several of these tones to just darken appropriately. I'm also going to just introduce a little bit of the Caput Mortem Violet into this as well, just as a really nice dark tone. It really accents the orange tones really nicely within this. I'm also just going to blend every now and then with the white pencil, help smooth everything out. So we're just going to work on section by section, starting over here. I'm just going to avoid adding in this really light section for now, and I'm just adding in a sort of fur and hair around it. So I'm using the burnt ochre and just blending out the dark area, just really lightly going around the dark bit, and then just using some of the darker tones just to accent the very centre of where you've got the shadow, and again just blending that out as well. And then just using the final dark colour, which is generally the walnut brown, just to add in the very centre of the dark area. And I'm also going to use the walnut brown just to add a few fur lines coming down certain strands of fur. I'm just using the white to just really highlight areas as well. So the raw umber is a really good colour for like the top bits where you've got a little bit of a yellow tinge, but it's still slightly brown. So I'm just using the raw umber for those kinds of bits, and just using it quite heavily where you've got a darker section, and then where you've got the lighter section towards the top of the strand of the hair, I'm just gradually lifting the pressure off the pencil to blend it out. So this dark section here is pretty much done. I just need to work on this lock of fur surrounding it. So I'm just going in there with some of the burnt ochre, adding in a few fur strands coming down and just creating like a softer edge. And just varying the colours up a little bit, using the walnut brown to add in the really dark sections of the fur, and that's what really helps to create that sort of dimension. I'm just going into the edges of that strand of fur and adding in a dark area. A little bit of a darker tone around there. There's this lighter section which is coming over here as well. So where I do have those lighter sections and haven't quite added them in, I'm just going in with the white pencil and just really hard, like using a hard pressure and just adding that down so we got the sort of shape of that little section, and then I'm just going around and shading it with the various other tones, and then we can go over and we can shade that white section as well. But we just want that white, or the piece of hair that's overlaying, we want that to stand out first and foremost, and add the shading around, and then we can go in and shade it if necessary. I'm just using the walnut brown for a majority of this, just really lightly. You can also switch to using like a nougat or another type of brown if you feel that you're being too heavy-handed with the walnut brown, for instance, or something like that. So you just want to really create shadow underneath where you have these pieces of flyaway hair laying over the top. And just being really delicate with your colours and just really slowly building the layers and the tones. So we will be adding in some flyaway hairs and everything over the top. Just going to see if the white will indent here. Going to just sharpen up that white pencil a little bit. If not, then we'll switch to using the slice tool or the scalpel. Just blending out a few of those fur patches as well, so they look really nice and soft. So just got a nice sharp pencil. Just trying to overlay some of the white. This would work really well if you was using a solvent. Then you'd get a really nice overlay of white, but when you're using blending with the white pencil, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to layer white colours over, especially these lighter tones. But if you just persevere and go over and over, you can get some whiter tones over there, but I think the slice tool is going to allow us to just to get a little bit more sort of definition here and there. So I'm just going in and using some more walnut brown. I'm just adding really gentle lines through the top here, just to sort of give the impression that that's got some fur texture up there. But it's this main clump here that we need to do now. So we've got several different tones going on here, and there's a little bit of like a wave to this section here as well. I'm just adding in a slight wave, and again making sure that I go around certain bits of hair and just add in the dark shadows surrounding them. This lock is a lot lighter in tone than the ones just sitting directly next to it, so we're going to keep this one quite light and just move on to the next section of fur. And I'm just going to use some of the burnt ochre just to add in these bits. I'm just following the shapes and adding in any darker parts and areas with the burnt sienna to begin with. So if we start a few little dark areas here. This is why I like to work in clumps like this, because then you sort of capture any areas that you've sort of missed. I'm also going to use some Indian red in this bit as well, because it's quite a dark reddy tone underneath this area. So we've got this large section of this sort of gingery tone here, which we're just going to add in as well. Just using the burnt ochre. Going to use a little bit of the Venetian red. Going to blend it with the white pencil as well. And then add in some small little details using the walnut brown, so a little bit of fur texture, so just bringing a few lines down. Just putting in a bit of a harsher shadow around that area so it just stands out a little bit more. So you can see that you've got some pieces of hair that are coming up and over, and then you've got these two bits that come down the side, almost like a fringe on the cow. I'm just going to just really darken some of these areas where I feel that they really need accenting. Going to use some red violet here and there as well. And I'm also just going to introduce a little bit more of a yellow tone to some of these lighter locks. So this section here is really light coming down to where we've just added this section. So what I'm going to do there is just going to use the white just to really sort of highlight that section so it's easy to see. Also blends it out really nicely as well. And then directly around that area I'm just going to take some walnut brown and I'm just going to really lightly shade. So we've got the definition of this lock sitting over the top. Like so. So we've got this piece just here, and we also need to go in and tone it so that it's got a little bit of shadow underneath this other tiny little piece that's overlapping. But I'm just going to go into this and just use some of the Venetian red and just bring some Venetian red lines down through this main section here. So just going to tone this small hair section where it meets this little bit that's overlapping here. Just needs a little bit of a darker colour, so I'm just going in with the Venetian red and just mapping that in so that you've really got the definition of this smaller strand just overlapping slightly. So this just takes a little bit of patience, just a little bit of altering. That's why I like to use a light pressure as well, so that we can go in and alter anything if necessary. It just takes a little bit of time to get looking 100% correct. I'm just going to go in and shade that with some light flesh and then follow that with some yellow. Give it a nice yellow, golden sort of straw tone. And his hair is really starting to come to life now. So we've just got this last section over here to do. So I'm just going to shade this top bit here where he's got a little bit of sort of stray fur or hair coming off the side here. So I'm just going to really exaggerate some of that and add that in. I'm just going to use a little bit of a different tone just to add in some darker strands through this top section here. I'm going to go in with some Venetian red, is what I'm using at the moment, but I'm also going to use some of the burnt sienna just to add in some dark area directly where this sort of sprouts from behind these ones that are sitting more forward. And then finally we've just got these last darker sections just to fill in down here. So I'm just going in and adding in dark lines and then just blending them out into the surrounding area so they're not quite as prominent and obvious. So just using the walnut brown now just to add in some more sort of defining lines. Also just going to use the white just to accent and highlight a few areas. Just add in a few strands coming round and down in certain places too. And once I'm happy with that, which I think I am pretty much there with, maybe just a little bit of toning on this bit here. Apart from that, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. So what I'm going to do now is just go in with a little bit of the slice craft knife. I'm just going to just scrape away some of the sort of fur that's sort of sitting on top, so we just get this sort of scraggly look. Just coming in slightly different directions across the fur and just scraping it away so you get these really sort of really subtle highlighted areas. It's ever so subtle. There we go. So just a few little highlighted lines there, not too many. Just gives the illusion that it's sort of a bit more three-dimensional than what it is. Okay, so now that we've added in the lighter section, we can go ahead and start to fill in this darker section underneath, which is really going to make this top section sort of sit up a bit more. This is going to be the same technique as what we've used for this, it's just going to be slightly different tones. So what we're going to do first, we're actually going to go in with the walnut brown and just start to map in some of these darker areas. So I'm just going to, again, start on this side and just work over. So we're just going to fill in all of these long strands that you can see coming over and down his face, and then the rest of it is pretty much just short fur from there on out. So this, again, takes some really careful planning. Really careful mapping out. Just mapping in all of the darker areas, just using a really light pressure to begin with. So I'm just going to gently go around some of these fur strands as well. Just gently map these in, just the ends of them where you have these really dark sections. So I'm also just mapping in some of the darker areas and direction from where the strands are coming from. So this just takes some really careful planning. So you can just see all the different shapes of the dark areas that I'm mapping in here. So as we come across, just starting to map in these other areas now. So as I'm doing this, I'm making sure that I follow the direction of each strand that's sort of sitting underneath as well. So not just going in the direction of the strand I'm working on, just looking at the direction of strands underneath, seeing if there's any difference. So I'm just going to work on doing this section just here. So this small section through the middle is where we're going to just focus. I'm going to start to fill in the actual bulk of the colour as well. So majority of the fur just sort of comes up from this section and kind of comes down, so that's the direction in which we need to start to add these fur lines and that kind of thing. I'm just adding in a really light layer to begin with. And then just bringing down some darker areas, some darker segments, and just starting to bring these down in the direction that the fur's coming down here. So just starting to sort of waterfall down. Again, just making sure that you pay attention to any sort of overlapping areas and that kind of thing. But we can remove the colour from the overlapping areas anyway, so if you do make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Okie dokie, so now I'm going to add the base layer of the ivory. So I'm going to start with these bits of fur that are coming over the top here. because these are the main ones that we're sort of filling in. Just filling in the direction that the fur is sort of coming over the top here, and sort of waving the pencil in the direction it's coming in. I'm just going to fill in these first few strands here. I'm going to tone them first of all with some of the light flesh and the cinnamon. So I'm going to start with the light flesh. Just working in the direction that the fur is flowing. Going in with some of the cinnamon. Got a little piece of hair just floating around on the surface of the drawing there. It's just, you can see it in the shadow. So we've got these pieces of fur in here. So now I'm going to go over with some of the Venetian red, because this is more of a red tone more rather than an orange tone. So I'm just going to add in the Venetian red, and I'm going to start to add this going in the using some fur lines going in the direction of the fur. At the base where you've got these darker areas, I am just going in and just darkening them ever so slightly. Just using a really light pressure to add this in. So I'm just going to go in here, just start to add some darker sections, which is just going to help to define all of the fur. So I'm just going in the directions that I can see these darker strokes going in. And just adding this to all of the fur sections and just adding lines through the fur just to break it up a little bit, just so we get that sort of nice natural sort of dissection between all the different strands. I'm going to add some burnt sienna to some of the dark areas as well, just to help tone them up. So some of the surrounding dark areas just have a slightly too sort of a cool tone, so we just need to add in a slightly warmer tone. So I'm just going into some of those with the burnt sienna. So as I do this, just can really see everything sort of coming together. I'm just going into some of the darker areas around the edge just with some more walnut brown, and also just going in with the burnt sienna as well to darken it up so that we get this really nice light piece of fur coming down over the top. I'm going to go in there and darken slightly, so just putting a little bit more pressure on the pencil to darken this up. I'm going to also add some of the manganese violet into these dark areas and just to the shadow areas on some of the fur strands. It just helps to really accentuate that orange. It creates a really nice shadow tone as well. So there's those couple of fur strands quite prominent there. I need to just lighten one or two with the white. Just blend a little bit of one out. Can add some of the Indian red in here as well, just for a little bit of that different tone. Okay, so the rest of this fur is the next section that we'll be adding to. We just wanted to focus on these sort of secondary strands that were underneath. There's also this really white strand on top of this bit here that we just need to add in. So I'm just going in with some of the ivory through there just to really accentuate that. And the sort of more orange piece directly next to that, I'm just going in and just adding a little bit more burnt ochre down there. So that white bit is really, really white now. I'm also just going to add in the strand that comes over. I might go in there with a slice tool and start to add that in. Just got a nice sort of white overlay there. Going to go over that with the white pencil. Just helps really accentuate it then. So now that we've got that bit in, we can just fill in this bit underneath this next really light section. So to fill in that, I'm just going to go straight in with the ivory. There's no real direction on this very top section, but this bit sort of comes down in this way. I'm going to go straight over that with some cinnamon. Followed by some of the Venetian red. And then I'm just going to layer some of the burnt ochre down here as well. I'm going to go in and highlight a few of the lighter sections. And just blend everything out a little bit. And then just go into the darker areas with some of the burnt sienna. And just gently shade the darker sections before going in with another layer of the walnut brown. So the walnut brown's next. So that's that bit pretty much done. Then we just need to tone up this lighter section just here, and I just need to bring the darker section which comes over the top of that lighter section down a little bit. So we can tone this. I'm going to use some slight shade of the light flesh, and that's pretty much it. Might even go in with a little bit of the warm grey 4 just to go into the shadows, and I might even just add a tiny little bit of the ultramarine in there because it's slightly cooler toned, just on the underside where you're going to catch that shadow. Then I'm going to blend that out with the white, like so. So the next couple of bits we're just going to go back to plotting in with the walnut brown. So we've just got a few sections here that we just need to add in. So you've got a long bit that sort of just drapes down over the eye and comes down here. Then you've just got a small section here that just sort of comes up and drops back down. It just comes in a slightly different direction, so we're just adding in that direction of that texture. Like so. And then all we're going to do is just lightly fill in this bit. This is where the eye is sort of sitting here. It's quite dark here, so I'm just adding in a light shading of the walnut brown over that, and it just sort of feathering it up into where the lighter fur is sitting as well. And just by these little tendrils just here, there is another little fur direction change. So we'll just be coming sort of out and over like this on this section just here. So I'm just going to go in now and just add a layer of the ivory over this entire section. That bit's not that same, that's part of that bit there, just so we don't get confused on that bit. So just starting to add in a few of the bits that are coming over. Okay, so just adding in this large section here before it changes direction. It's just coming straight down. It comes down just sort of above the nose, like just here. Just coming into that section. Like that. So a nice layer of the ivory down. And then we're just going to build in the tone, going in lightly with some light flesh to begin with. just using really long fur strokes just to fill in this texture. Going in with some of the burnt ochre. And just doing exactly the same. Just sort of filling in where you can see the darker areas first. And then just going in and just adding some really long, nice fur strokes down of this tone. I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna and just add in the darker areas. Going to go in with some red violet as well into these darker sections up here. I'm going to blend that with the white slightly. I'm going to use a little bit of the cadmium orange just to really sort of highlight that orange tone through that section. I'm going to switch to using some of the Indian red. I'm just going to focus on this section, which is just coming in a slightly different direction over here. It's a slightly different red tone as well. I'm also going to use some of the red violet in there. It's quite a dark tone through here. Just through that initial section just there. Just using the burnt sienna just to really lightly add in this under layer before going back in with the white and just really defining that strand which is coming over the top. Use a little bit of the dark indigo to just add a little bit of shadow in this section here. Oops. And at the top here as well, just where you've got this sort of direction change. Adding in some red violet to the shadow section of that, so that sort of really sort of bright blondie strand shines through. I'm going to go through and use some of the burnt sienna just to add some separation between some of these strands, and then going in with the walnut brown as well. really dark section in here, which is perfect. I'm just going to lighten up a few strands with the white. And then go around some of the strands with the walnut brown just to really accentuate the sort of lighter bits and accentuate the texture of that section of hair. I'm just going to go around this strand here a little bit more and just add in a few more darker tones around it and just make sure that I shade it appropriately so that it blends in with the rest of the fur. I don't want it to stick out like a sore thumb, just want it to blend in naturally. Or as naturally as possible. So we just need to fill in this last little section here. So there's a little bit of an overlay from this little strand here, but then this is all pretty much just dark fur. So I'm just going to shading with some of the ivory, and then we're going to jump straight in with some of the cinnamon. Now making sure that I use or go in the direction of this section of fur. I'm just using rough sort of lines to fill that in. And I'm going to go in with some manganese violet, which is just going to help these shadow areas as well. Going to use some of the burnt sienna to just shade down and tone some of the darker areas and just blend out some of the shadows as well. I'm going to use the white pencil to just add in some strands of white. And then I'm going to use some of the Indian red and some of the walnut brown and just really gently just start to shade this just to make sure that everything's looking okay. We need to go in and really darken up this section and blend it out. So just adding in some really dark areas right in the centre where this sort of fur parts or the hair parts. Just adding in all of the shading. There's quite a dark tone around here as well. I'm just going in with some burnt ochre and some of the burnt sienna. Just really adding the form down. Just partitioning some of the strands of the hair. It's also using some of the red violet as well to tone some of those shadows. So you want to get the shape right of these areas as well. So I'm just going to use the white pencil just to highlight some of these lighter strands that are waterfalling down. I'm just going to go through and just continue to shade some of these sections in here. Just want to get rid of a lot of the sort of lighter tones within there. I'm going to use a little bit of the yellow. Also just going to use some of the Indian red on this bit here. We're going to use the scalpel just to pull out a few highlights. I'm also going to go in there with some of the cadmium orange. But now we're going to take the slice tool and just add in some highlights onto that bit. So coming down from this strand up here, we're just going to bring in some of the sort of flyaway strands, so it looks like that this lighter strand is sitting on top. I'm just going to scrape away slightly to just define some of these lines through this area, and then we can just shade that bit where we've scraped back a little bit with some more orange. I'm just adding in some flyaway hairs off of this lighter strand up here as well. So we've just got a lot of lighter strands on top. There we go. So I'm just going to ever so lightly just shade some of this section here with the cadmium orange. And then that completes that little lock there. So that's pretty much it for that layer of fur. So now all we need to do is go in and just add the rest of the fur. So this bit is slightly not as complicated as this section that we've just filled in, but it is a fairly complicated section. But you're basically just going to bring the fur coming down here, and then it transitions into this sort of softer looking fur. But we're going to fill in this ear and do this horn as well to complete the top of the head. But you can kind of see the kind of mess and the sort of matted look of the Highland cow that's going on here. It's got some softer strands of fur going up through the top of the head. And what we're going to do as well is, once we've done this ear and the horn, we're just going to assess what needs changing, if any of the tones that need it changing, any shading or anything like that. I may introduce, like you can see straight off, that this bit needs a little bit of a blue shading. Using that blue and orange together just gives a really nice shadow tone. I'm going to introduce a few blue strands through the fur as well, just to sort of break it up a little bit, just give it a little bit more interest. Just creates a really nice shadow tone as well. So let's move on to the ear and the horn.